This film is more than a story. It's a call to remember, a legacy of gratitude that challenges each of us to honor, to appreciate, and to carry the past forward.
My father, Avraham Munk, was born in 1915 in Warsaw, Poland, and as a young child, the family relocated to Lodz, Poland. My father had a fairly good, uneventful upbringing. He went to cheder, then he went to the equivalent, I guess, of junior high. Unfortunately, the family had difficulty in making ends meet. And my father had to leave his education and became a designer for shirts. He became a Schneider, a cutter, and he did that for several years. At the same time, he was very active in a Zionist youth organization called Beitar, which was founded by Zev Jabotinsky, and had quite a following. Youth in those days were looking for something. They were looking for some other meaning than being in the galus, working from probably 12 hours a day, and no hope or no end in sight for anything better. And the purpose of the organization, or the main mission of the organization, was trying to eventually establish a homeland in Eretz Yisrael, with Yerushalayim as the capital, which was not always the same goal of every Zionist organization. They were very respectful of Yiddishkeit. They weren't anti-religion. And their economic platform was one of capitalism, live and let live, not socialism, not communism, unlike some other organizations as well.
In the beginning of 1939, Avraham was drafted into the army. That would have been unfortunate for most people, but for him, he was almost proud of that.
He felt that he would be given the opportunity to learn self-defense and weapons and discipline.
If he could learn military strategy, if he could learn what it meant to be a devoted and an accomplished soldier, he would be able to go to Eretz Yisrael, and he would be a soldier there in the army if Eretz Yisrael had one, and he would be able to build the country. So he was very proud to be in the Polish army. And now all the Jews that were in the army became prisoners of war, and all the Polish people were also prisoners of war.
He was sent to Germany in a prisoner of war camp called Stalag 2A, which was in Neue Brandenburg in Germany. Thousands of prisoners at that point in time.
Now this was illegal what they did, but they separated the Gentiles from the Jewish prisoners of war. And Avraham realized that as a Jew, he would stand no chance against the Nazis. And so as they were lining up the Jewish prisoners of war and the Gentile prisoners of war, he ran to the line of the Gentiles.
And as Hashgacha would have it, the German soldier there acknowledged to my father that yes, he saw that he had jumped the line, but he did nothing about it. Instinctively, at that point in time, my father started to call himself Albert, and he became Albert Munk.
All the prisoners of war, the Gentile prisoners of war, they were taken out to a farmland. They would be working the farms, and that's how they would serve the Nazis.
Avraham, or now Albert, knew what was happening out there. The rumors, the horror stories, the terrible fate facing Jews across Europe. But on the estate, things felt different. It wasn't freedom. not even close. But as long as he kept his head down and did his work, he was left alone. In a world gone mad, it was clear Hashem had placed him there. For now, this was his refuge.
My father was treated well there, as were the other prisoners.
For a time, this arrangement held. The Germans got labor, and the prisoners got routine. But by 1940, patience wore thin, and the men were released from captivity.
A few days later, my father gets a message to come to see the owner of the estate, Mr. Hansen.
And he said to Mr. Munk, "Du bist ein Jude? Are you a Jew?" And Albert was terrified. He didn't know what the right answer was. And then Mr. Hansen said to him, "Don't worry, I know you're Jewish. You see, we screened the mail, and we saw that you're getting mail from Lodz, from your parents. But I've been watching you, and you're a special person, and I'm gonna take care of you."
And he wanted him to stay with him. He didn't want him to go back. He said, "Stay here through the whole war. I'll take care of you."
Albert heard the words. They were kind. They were sincere. But he couldn't sit still. He stood up, his voice firm.
"Thank you, Herr Hansen. But how can I stay here when my parents and sister are stuck in a ghetto? I need to help them."
He said, "Don't be ridiculous. They'll kill you. You could get killed on the way." He said, "I've got to risk my life. I've got to be with my parents."
He tried to talk sense into him, begged him to be smart and stay out of danger. But Albert wouldn't budge. He couldn't just sit there while his parents and sister were suffering. Even if it meant risking his life, he wasn't going to abandon them. Hansen saw the resolve in his eyes, and he gave in. But one thing was clear. Albert could not travel as a Jew.
So listen what he did. Albert Bernhard Hansen gave him 800 francs. He gave him a new suitcase, a new valise, so it shouldn't look like he's coming from someplace else. And he wrote him a letter. He wrote him a letter that he's of German origin and that he's a very important worker. And with those things in hand, he went and he came to Lodz.
Went back to Lodz Ghetto, walks up to the entry point, and he says, and they said, "Papers?" Hands his papers, and they look at him, and they say, "What do you want here?" He says, "I want to go in." They said, "If you want to go in, please go ahead." You know, sort of in a mocking tone. I mean, who is this insane individual that wants to go into the Lodz Ghetto?
They said, "Okay, we'll let you in, but you're not coming out." And he said, "No problem. My parents are there, my sister's there. Open the door."
In retrospect, the ghetto was the place to live and to try to create a life, however difficult that was, until deportation. Lodz was the second largest ghetto in Poland.
Albert, now back as Avraham, joined his parents in the Lodz Ghetto, where life became a daily struggle for survival. The days dragged on, filled with hunger, sickness, hard labor, and the constant fear of what might come next. Time moved slowly, and hope was hard to hold on to, but somehow they kept going.
In 1941, his father became a night watchman in the gardens, and during the day he slept. So one day he came home to sleep early in the morning, and there was an appel. The Germans called everybody out to come to the outside, and they were going to select who should be sent off to the work camps. They started to search the houses to see if there were anybody hiding in the apartments. They found my grandfather sleeping, and they hit him over the head with the butt of a rifle.
The brutal murder of Rabbi Paysach Munk shattered the world of the young Avraham Munk. But the mitzvah of kibud Avraham ran through his veins. It was woven into his very being. So there was no question. No matter the risk, he was determined to give his father a Kavri Yisrael.
So he and his friend Yisrael Margolis took off the door of the apartment, and they put my Zeta on the door, and they carried the door down the stairs, and it was nighttime, there was a curfew. Any Jew that would be caught on the street would be summarily killed on the spot. And in the middle of the night, they took him to the wall of the cemetery a few blocks away, and they threw the body over the wall, and then they climbed over the wall into the cemetery too. And they carried him and put him in the first available grave that was already dug. And they put him in, and they buried him, they covered him up. They put a stick with his name on the grave, said a few words, and then quickly made it back to their residence so they wouldn't be caught, hopefully, on the way back.
Although Avraham Munk was able to have his father buried, but he knew that they would have to go.
The ghetto was liquidated. My father, his mother Rivka, and his sister Ruth were on the last train out of Lodz to Auschwitz. There was a selection. My father was sent to one side. My grandmother and my aunt were sent to another side, and that was the last that my father saw of his family.
His mother was taken straight to her death. His sister Ruth disappeared, and no one ever heard from her again. The family searched for years, trying everything to find out whatever happened to her, but nothing ever turned up. Just silence.
Subsequently, he was sent to another concentration camp called Elrich and Dora Mittelbau, which my father said was Gehinnom. He said, if Auschwitz was bad, this was worse. He walked in there and he would see everybody was chalk white. They were digging pits and caves for V-2 rockets for the German military. And they were being dug in chalk caverns. And the chalk would permeate their skin, and they were chalk white. And the survival rate of the prisoners there was very, very minimal.
The war finally ended, and Avremel was liberated from Bergen-Belsen. His life had been spared, but just barely.
My father at the time weighed 90 pounds. I saw some of his hospital records. It was horrible. He was suffering from severe malnutrition. They didn't expect him to make it, but again, the Eibishter looked out for him and he survived.
The question afterwards is, how do you return to life? One of the things that the Swedish government did was to take some survivors and bring them to Sweden, where they healed them. One of the organizations that did an enormously heroic job on that was something called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the Joint.
Sweden agreed to take 10,000 survivors of the concentration camps, and Avremel was one of them. Avremel felt so uplifted as he made his way with hundreds and hundreds of others to come to Sweden.
He was very active in Sweden. He worked for the Jewish Distribution Committee. They had him do kiruth. My job, he says, was to try to get young Jewish men and women survivors to remain Jewish and go on aliyah. There was a lot of intermarriage. The Goyim were very kind to the Jewish survivors, and it was a horrible situation.
But Avremel and some other Yiddish friends, people that had a commitment to Yiddishkeit, they went to these young men and young women and pleaded with them, come with us. We'll give you rooms. We'll give you place. We'll give you food. But please don't marry out of the faith. I know the Swedes are wonderful, and he helped many, many, many people get married and that they remained building Yiddish families.
My father met my mother there, who is also a survivor from Slobodka, Kovna, and she was in the camps in 43 and 44. My mother was actually traded for war material 6 weeks before the war ended from Bergen-Belsen with hundreds of other Jewish girls and ended up in Sweden. My father was 12 years older than my mother. But, you know, a lot of, my father used to say, he used to look at my mother, he felt much younger. And my mother used to say, I looked at the de, they use a prefix, the de, you know, they use the formal approach, that der Tata. And I felt much older. And he says, it was beautiful. He says, we were the right age. They were married for over 60 years. My father was not a very emotional sort of individual. After the war, he wrote poetry, trying to cope with the hardships that he had experienced. He talked about his life that was gone, the home that was no longer there, his mother, Shabbos. Then he talked about the crematoria that he saw in Auschwitz. He talked about the future and about Yerushalayim and his hope and his emunah that there is a future to the Jewish people and that all this suffering will be a thing of the past, but Am Yisrael will survive. And that was all in the small sefer, which subsequently has been translated.
Sweden was peaceful, even beautiful. After everything they'd been through, Avraham and Kraina found a measure of comfort there. Avram got a job at the Atlas diesel motor factory. Different work, but they quickly saw what he was capable of. But then they looked around. So many friends had slowly given in, trading identity for acceptance. And with their new baby Zev in their arms, the question hit hard. How would he stay strong in his Yiddishkeit in a place like this?
As much as Avraham and his friends tried to get people not to intermarry, many did. And even those that remained with Jewish spouses, but the schooling was not a frum schooling. And so Avraham had to make that decision, that difficult decision, that he was going to leave Sweden.
But before they could move forward, Avraham had unfinished business in Lodz. His father's grave still lay bare, and he couldn't leave it that way. A proper matzeva was the least he could do to honor the man who had given him everything.
My mother had a sister, Mary. Mary's husband was my uncle Nathan, and Nathan, or Nusen, had parents that were in Uzbekistan during the war. And after the war, they came back from Uzbekistan. A lot of them went back, congregated in Lodz, because that's where the organizations were trying to gather the survivors in Poland. And my father contacted them, sent them some money and said, please go to the cemetery in Lodz, see if you can find that stick with the name of my father, and please, if you can do it, here's money, put up a matzeva, and bring a minyan together and say Kaddish. And that's what they did. So my father was always very proud of that he brought his father to Kever Yisrael, and it was part of his kibud Ave.
But the story of his father's kvura did not end there. Many years later, Avraham still thought about his father, buried in Lodz.
We always talked, and one of the things he talked about was saying, he hated the fact that his father was buried in Poland. I said, why? He said, my father disliked Poland. He wanted to be in Eretz Yisrael, but obviously the situation didn't allow it. He disliked Poland immensely. So I said, Dad, so what do you think we should do? He said, what can you do? I said, why not find him at the kever and remove him and rebury him in Eretz Yisrael? He said, great idea, let's do it. Subsequently, I found Harav Hirschsprung in Montreal, And he gave me direction. And I spoke to Rabbi Besser, who was also involved. So we got all the appropriate documentation and permission to go over to Poland and to dig up Zayda and bring him back to Eretz Yisrael. We get to Poland. It was the first trip for my mother and my father back to Poland in 1989. We go back, we look, and we look, and we look, and we can't find the kever. Totally despondent, totally depressed. There's this lady who was married, not a Jewish woman, married to a cousin of someone that my parents knew in Montreal. And she says, I'm going to help you. I don't even remember her name. She says, I'm going to help you. I'm going to look. And she spent weeks looking. And then after several weeks, she sends back a picture. She says, I found the kever. It sank about 18 inches with time and overgrowth and weeds, etc. It had been vandalized, but the pieces of the matzeva I found all around this kever. And this is it. And it fits perfectly in the insert in the matzeva. And she put it, and it was identical to the picture, including the name and the date, etc. And this was it. And my father says, that's it.
Here we are in the cemetery. The grass is high, looking for the grave of Moshe Munk, which has been located in the distance.
And we went to Eretz Yisrael, and the next day we arrived in Yerushalayim, and they took the remains, and we had a levaya on Har Menuchos in 1992. He was killed in 1941, reburied 51 years later in Eretz Yisrael, fulfilling his sort of dream of ending up in Eretz Yisrael.
לנשמת הקדוש רב מוישה ורב שרגא שהלך לו ונהרג על קידוש השם ושלח לו לעמו.
And my father fulfilled a mission, a final physical act of kibud Avraham for his father.
We continue our story back in 1949. With his act of kibud Av complete and the matzeva in Lodz erected by the Blankrot family, Avraham and Kreina left Sweden, set out for a new chapter. Together with their little son Zev, they made their way to Montreal, Canada, hoping to build a life filled with warmth, stability, and a future where their son could grow up proud and strong in his Yiddishkeit.
We had plans to go or to United States or to Israel, but we went to Canada. I had a friend living in Montreal, which was with me in Sweden before, but he went to Montreal, and I was receiving letters from him, and he said, Montreal, he said, is a beautiful city, and I would like, if you want to emigrate, this is the place.
Avraham, who now began to go by Abe, began humbly, working as a custodian in a garment factory. But after learning English, he took a bold leap and started his own business, one that with Hashem's help brought him success. Zev grew up and settled in Houston, Texas after completing medical school, and he and his wife Susan built a beautiful Torah-centered family. Avram and Kreina were later blessed with another son, Raphael, or Ralph, who became an accomplished engineer and builder. Their family continued to grow and blossom, and when Avraham left this world at the age of 97, he did so as a proud great-grandfather, leaving behind a legacy of faith, strength, and generations who carry his story forward.
Over the years, my father would always tell me the story about Hans von Blumenhof and how nice and he had been to him, relatively speaking, and how essentially it saved his life and did some tremendous chesed for him by helping him survive the prisoner of war camps in Stalag 2A. We tried to find him, but we couldn't locate him easily. But my father always wanted to express his hakaras hatov.
He talked about this Hans von Blumenhof, and I was like, there's gotta be a way now to find that guy. So we asked a couple people for some different recommendations of researchers.
And that's when we hired the researcher in Germany who subsequently contacted us several weeks later saying, good news, I found him. He's not Hans von Blumenhof. His name is Albert Hansen, who used to own the Blumenhof estate. And not only that, I have located 2 of his grandchildren, 2 of his granddaughters, who would be more than happy to communicate with you and eventually meet. So all of a sudden, they get these emails and these letters from this Jewish doctor in Houston, Texas, asking to meet with some of his relatives because of the chesed that their grandfather, who they always felt guilty about, did for Abe Munk, Avraham Munk, during World War II, and they were intrigued. They were intrigued, and they were quite happy that maybe their grandfather was exonerated a little bit from the bad rap that he had all these decades.
That just recently, Dr. Munk took children and grandchildren, and the whole family went together to Germany, to a small town, to the gravesite of Albert Bernard Hansen. And the reason that they did that was hakaras hatov, because it was Albert really that wanted to protect Avraham, and because he cared so much for Avraham, Zev Munk felt that it's the only proper thing to explain to the family the hakaras hatov they do to this Gentile from the Hasidic Ummos Olam.
And it was quite a moving experience. Chazal tell us you save one life, you save an entire world. And look around. And this is all possible because of that individual over there, lying there, because he was kind to my father and didn't hand him over to the SS, protected him, tried to do whatever he could. And it's because of him that we're here. My father always had tremendous hakaras hatov to his ancestors, to all the preceding generations of Yidden, who for their mesiras nefesh, for their dedication, for the trials and tribulations that they underwent to make sure that there would be a hemshech hadoros, that the Masorah would be transmitted. And it's a lesson that I learned that it's up to us to do the same, to continue with transmitting our Masorah, doing everything that we can to make sure that Klal Yisrael will survive.
One act of courage can change everything. Albert Hansen's quiet kindness didn't just save a life. It built a family, shaped a future, and echoed through generations. Avramel's hakaras hatov wasn't only for the man who saved him. It was also for his parents, whose memory he honored with unwavering devotion. His kibud Avim was a living expression of that gratitude. This isn't just a story. It's a charge to us all, a mission to carry his legacy forward. We owe it to those who came before us to never forget, to live their legacy and continue their greatness.